Welcome to this week that was. This has been a week where, for one reason or another, I've been dragged into or voluntarily entered debates about the concept of three lines of defence. This is a concept that is being very actively debated in our profession at the moment. For those of you unfamiliar with the concept, just a quick recap. A number of years ago, the Institute of Internal Auditors came up with this concept that essentially said for governance to be good and well-founded, one needed to have a first-line set of functions, in other words, the functions that owned the risk, created the risk, managed the risk. A second-line function, in other words, a series of functions that were responsible for challenging and overseeing the way risk is managed. And last but by no means least, a third line function, namely the internal audit profession, that looked at the role of the first line in relation to the second line. And the terminology was first line of defence. In other words, this governance structure was seen as being defensive in its orientation. This model was revised by the Institute a few years ago. The term defence was removed. In other words, we're looking at the offensive side of life, to use an Americanism, and the relationships between first and second line was rendered a lot more malleable. Where are we going? Well, there is a very active debate as to what happens next. I just wanted to share my own philosophies on this for what it's worth. To be frank, I don't care how many lines of defence we have. I would say the nature, scale and complexity of a business should dictate the number of lines, in other words, the number of layers of control that a business feels it needs. But what I believe is non-negotiable is the continuing existence of an independent internal audit function, an objective internal audit function, and an internal audit function that operates with integrity. Now, do I believe that every single business should have an internal audit function? The answer is no. I think it actually really depends on what's at stake. But where I believe our societies need to have a red line is to make sure that where there is a public interest at stake, in other words, a public interest entity, an organisation that citizens are totally reliant on and are victims if this organisation goes wrong or blows up, then an independent, objective internal audit function should be non-negotiable, should be required by law, should be protected by regulation. I don't know what you think, but I would very much like to hear your views. Yesterday was also a first for me. I had the privilege of being interviewed by Richard Chambers as part of his podcast. More details soon. Other than that, it's August. Things are relatively quiet. Time for thinking, time for reflection. Talk soon.